Hello everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, Best Practices for Building Universal Web Applications with Sencha Ext JS and RAD Server, brought to you by Sencha. Sencha has provided today's attendees with a free white paper in the handout section, so be sure to download that before the end of the presentation. We're going to go ahead and run a quick poll that Sencha has provided. Just want to learn a little bit about the audience here. So if you could take a moment and go ahead and get your answers in. While you guys are doing that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to our presenter for today. So we have Mark Guzmano. He is a solutions architect at Sencha and has more than 30 years of experience in the software services industry. He has been extensively involved with custom HTML5 browser and mobile development projects, using his experience to build HTML5 single-page applications. Mark has a passion for building outstanding software, especially leading-edge, user-centric applications.
We're going to talk about the universal app creation experience with Ext JS, and with our recent acquisition, we are now sister companies with a company called Embarcadero, and they have a product called RAD Server, which I'd like to show you how to integrate with that product. So to get started, let's talk a little bit about the concept of building an application nowadays. It used to be you would build a desktop application initially, and then maybe mobile was an afterthought. But really nowadays, mobile's becoming less of an afterthought and even more of an equal or a primary goal. So in order to build applications, you've got to figure out, do I start with the desktop? Do I start with the mobile application? How do I do that? And that all gets to what we call universal applications. So we're going to start out with a little bit of discussion of that. Then we're going to go into actually building a universal application with Ext JS, and I'm going to introduce some tooling that we're in the midst of creating that may help you on your projects, and then take it into building a server with the RAD Server product. So let's move forward. So as I said, there's a couple of ways to approach building an application that's going to be what we term universal. You could take a mobile-first approach by building the mobile application first, which really implies progressively enhancing the application. So you start off with a simpler mobile UI and then maybe move on to a tablet or the desktop. And as you do so, you're going to put in more and progressively more enhanced implementations of your application. And that's certainly an approach that you can take in this world of needing to build mobile and desktop applications. The other approach that is the other end of the spectrum is taking a desktop-first approach, which, as the name implies, you build the desktop-oriented features for your application and then scale back or gracefully degrade those needs to make them appropriate for a smaller device like a mobile phone or a tablet. Each of these has its advantages, and that's really what we want to talk about. But in this world of building mobile or desktop applications, there's a lot of buzz out there about building responsive applications or using a responsive design concept. Everybody's talking about it. Designers, developers, key stakeholders on projects. So what is responsive design, and how does that relate to building mobile and desktop applications? Well, responsive design is a concept of building one user interface, designing for the desktop, and then keeping mobile in mind so that as you bring that application to a smaller device, it responds to that smaller device, and a lot of times it wraps key areas of the page to make them more accessible. Now, there are some challenges to that, like unnecessarily downloading data for a mobile device, but a responsive design approach does have its merits. So it's not a mobile-first design, it's a one-size-fits-all design. Build one application, and that one application would respond to the device. So I've got an example of that here, and I'll actually show you this example live. It's one of our examples that we have on the Ext JS samples page. It's called the Executive Dashboard. And as you can see here, I'm in a desktop layout where the menu is on the left-hand side. And as I make this application smaller, notice how it adapts to the smallness. Maybe this becomes a tablet and now the menu is on the top. So that's one area of responsiveness, is changing where things appear like menus on the page. You can also take a look at this admin dashboard application, another one of the samples we have on our samples page, and notice as I make this page smaller that the widgets in the middle of the page will begin to wrap. When I get to a certain point, they wrap down so that now if this was a tablet device, I now can see the entirety of the application without having to scroll sideways. So that's the concept of responsive design and responsive pages. There's also another concept that we've talked about with EXTJS called adaptive design. Adaptive design says when you get to a certain level of, let's say, the size of a phone, the look and feel of a grid, for example, makes no sense. You have to adapt to a different UI. In that particular case, perhaps you adapt to a list control. And probably the best way to understand this is to take, again, a look at another example. So here's our admin dashboard page on the email menu item, and you'll notice that this is a very rich interface. It's got a rich grid here, a lot of columns, several pieces of information. If I emulate a phone in this interface, this is totally unusable. I can't change the look. I can't make this look any better, even if I would have wrapped this grid to the bottom here. It's just not a very acceptable interface. So if I refresh this page, you'll notice that this page changes to using a list instead of the robust grid we were looking at a moment ago. So we've changed the control or the component that we're using to adapt to the device. So adaptive design. So this makes a much cleaner experience. So we have responsive, we have adaptive. So which direction should we go? Should we go mobile first? Should we go desktop first? How do we incorporate this adaptive stuff? I think the best way to look at this is think about an application you use a lot. And in my case, I use email quite a bit. Is that application mobile first or desktop first? I use, for example, Gmail. Well, it's both. If there's a mobile interface and a desktop interface. Is it responsive? Yeah, parts of it are. Is it adaptive? Yes. So think about that application for a moment. Is it one single application? Ask yourself this question. When you got to the office this morning, for the last email you got, did you read it on your mobile device, your tablet, or your desktop? If you use a good email client, you won't really be able to remember which one you actually read it on. That's because that application has been designed as a universal application that spans devices, and that should be our goal with business applications. So in today's world of applications, users do what I just talked about. They move from device to device while interacting with a single application, be it email or a custom application you build. So especially business and enterprise applications have this concept. I'm at my desk doing things, I have to get up and go into the plant. I have my phone, I have the same application. So the bottom line with all of that, the apps that we build must provide a quality experience no matter what device we use. We can use the concepts of responsive and adaptive, whatever works, but no matter what design we take, as developers, we should think universal. We should build into our application architecture the concept of a universal design with some of the things I've talked about here, where sometimes the device is responsive, sometimes it's adaptive, and we'll talk about how you do that with EXTJS as we move forward here. So building universal applications has a few concepts that are associated with it. Even though you're building applications that apply to a spectrum of devices, mobile, tablet, desktop, you want to share as much of the code as possible, especially non-visual things like data access. And in EXTJS, that means stores and models. Any programming logic you're creating, like controllers. All of that you should share as much as you can. And sometimes you can share views. There are certain places where responsive views make sense, and I can share 100% of the interface, but a lot of times I'll create a different interface, and that should be the case where it makes sense. Your projects should provide for a universal structure from the start, even if you are initially only building a desktop. I've been on many projects where that was the case, and some CEO or somebody involved in the project, a project sponsor, reads some article, and all of a sudden, the next Monday morning, he or she has a great idea. Let's build in mobile functionality where it never existed. So let's get in front of that curve and build universal functionality from the start of the project. And then finally, let's create tailored views for each type of application or each type of view we have where appropriate, and reuse as much as possible. This is where base classes can be a great approach in an EXTJS environment. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. So universal applications is the way to go. From a design point of view, don't sacrifice. Go for the best user interface design for mobile. And this is an example of an application we designed and built, and I will talk to you about where you can get access to it. And do the best design for the desktop. Your desktop has rich capabilities, utilize them. So don't think universal when you're doing design. Think best of breed for desktop and best of breed for your mobile devices. So with all this said, instead of talking about it, we at Sencha have built an application that responds to all of this, and it's called the co-working application. So if you go up to our website at the root page, you'll see that this is our home page. You'll see there's a big button here called Explore This App. This app is the co-working application. And I have a local version of it running here, just in case the demo gods were against me. And you'll notice that when I start out with a login page. And as I log in, the device detects, or the application detects, whether I'm on a desktop or I'm on a mobile phone, and will do the appropriate thing. In this case, I have the desktop interface. You'll notice that the home page is quite rich, many columns. I have subsequent pages that use very, very graphical, rich grids of data. So this represents the desktop version of my application. If I use Chrome's ability to allow me to emulate a phone, and I refresh the page, you'll notice that this page now looks appropriate for a phone. It's no longer a grid, it's a list, but it's using the exact same data as the rich application was using, or at least most of it. So this is an example that's freely available, that we've built on purpose to give you a sense of how to do this. And this GitHub site is where it's available to you, Sencha EXTJS-examples co-working. And you'll get these slides, so you'll be able to get to that point as well. This sample also has a server component to it, so you'll be able to see how data is served to it with Node.js in this particular case. We've also been thinking quite a bit on how to give you guys the capability of starting from scratch and building universal applications. And hopefully a lot of you that have been using EXTJS have discovered or are using Sencha Command. Sencha Command is our command line utility that's used to scaffold an application and to do a lot of other things. Although it's a bit dated, it's written probably almost getting on 10 years. It's based on Java, not JavaScript. And so we've been thinking a lot about our tooling and upgrading our tooling to Node and Node.js. Sencha Command has also had the ability for you to build different template applications to start off your application development. Although most people don't know that exists, and even those that do don't really know how to do that. So with those two things in mind, we focused on building some of this templating capabilities in a new node-based command line tool, and we've called it Sencha Node. And it's available on NPM. It's available for you to download. It is a working proof of concept. It works, but it's not completely tested. It doesn't do everything. But we encourage you to go take a look at it, and we definitely want feedback on it. You simply install this as a global NPM package, assuming you have Node. And once you've done that, you have the ability to run either Sencha Node or the shorthand SN for the tool. And you can see here, this is the initial commentary that comes out of the product if you just type the command SN or Sencha Node. What we're going to do is we're going to generate an application. And you'll notice that I have several different ways I can generate an application. Just like with Sencha command, I have the generate app command. I'm going to tell it where my Sencha SDK is. And the key here is I'm going to give it a template name. We currently have one template called Universal Modern. And then we say what's the name of our application and where do we want to put it, what folder. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this command here. And before I run it, I'm just going to change those last two steps to change the name of the project. We'll call it DZone. And we will call this particular folder that it goes in also DZone. And I'm going to go ahead and generate an application. So what this is doing is it's using this Universal Modern template to generate an application and make it available to me to start building upon. So let me change to that directory and open up a code window on that. I use Visual Studio Code, but you can use any editor that makes sense to you. Those of you who've used Sencha command will notice some similarities and some differences to the way Sencha command generates an application. We're using this opportunity to try to figure out if we can build a best practices template, or probably more reasonably, a set of best practices templates that we can get to you guys to allow you to build applications from the get-go that are structured the way you want. We also see it being important that you yourself should be able to take one of these templates, further modify it, and make that your project-oriented template. So given that, let me show you a couple of things that this template has, and I'm somewhat comparing this to what currently gets generated when you do a Sencha generate app with the traditional Sencha command. First thing you'll notice is that all the source code for this is under one folder, because when we build a universal application, we want to build varying profiles. The concept of profiles have existed in Sencha command for a while, and Ext JS, but you'll notice in this app.json, which is the configuration for the application, right from the get-go we build three different profiles: a classic desktop, a modern desktop, and a modern phone. Those represent what we feel are the three initial profiles you may want to use. You could add other ones. You could have a different profile for a mobile device, or for an iPad or a tablet. You could have varying profiles for varying sizes of devices. 3 is not a fixed number. It's just what we are using to initially put out what we think are the likely build profiles. So you'll notice the classic desktop uses the classic toolkit and Triton. The modern uses modern and material, and the phone uses the modern toolkit and Cordova, which is the way you package for a mobile device. As I said, there's quite a bit of thinking in terms of structuring the application. The source folder contains the different profiles, so everything's under one source folder, and then once you get to a source folder, this structure should look somewhat familiar. Models and stores and views. Under the view folder are the views that your UI is going to have. We cleaned that up a little bit and we added the ability now to put your SAS right within the same folder as your view, your CSS or SAS. So there's some details around this environment. As we're looking at this, let me go ahead and do a Sencha app build development. Now I'm back in Sencha command because the Sencha node tooling that we've been creating only works right now to do generated things. It only generates the starter code or generates a view package, which we'll get to in a moment. So I'm going to just build our application here. And you'll notice it's going to build every single profile. It's going to build the classic desktop, the modern desktop, and the modern phone. So our universal application is 3 different profiles. Actually, it's probably 2. You'll have to make a decision as to whether your desktop is going to be modern or classic, depending on what your needs are and what browser you support. So you can think of this as essentially 2 profiles, 1 profile for the phone and 1 profile for the desktop. But I'm building them all so that we can take a look at what these look like. You'll notice that when I get to the phone profile, we've built in the Cordova support right from the start, thinking that if you're building a mobile application, why not put in the extra steps to make it Cordova hybrid capable right from the start? Again, things we're thinking through to make it easier for you to build your universal applications. So let's have this finish, and when it finishes, let's go ahead and run Sencha Web App Watch. The reason I did a build on everything at one time is that Sencha App Watch will only watch 1 profile at a time. You'll notice it's watching the default profile, classic desktop. Although since I built everything now, all of the device profiles are available to me. And everything is at port 1841. So with all of that said, some of that I know is review for some of you, for some of you that may be new, but all that generation and building has given me the ability to do the following. To show you the template for the classic desktop version. This classic desktop version uses the classic toolkit and the Triton theme by default. The second tab here allows me to run port 1841 against the modern desktop. You'll notice when I ran the classic desktop, I didn't include classic desktop because it was the default, but I could have just as easily done this. I could have said, run me the classic desktop. And it will show me the classic desktop. So I've got a classic desktop, I've got a modern desktop, and I also have a modern phone. And you can see here that I'm emulating again with Chrome's emulation capabilities. And if I log in, I have the default home page and menuing structure for a default home, a default mobile hybrid application. You get all of this when you start. So this is all the scaffolding, all of the organization of the code is all done for you so that you can start knowing you have a universal structure from the get-go. Now, there's nothing that says if your application is just a desktop application for now that you just focus on the modern desktop or the classic desktop version. But the structure of the application allows you to very easily add another profile after the fact should you need to. So this is where we're starting. We've started generating our application. It is a universal application. It focuses on the desktop and the phone, and it also has shared characteristics and capabilities. So you'll notice the structure of the application in the source folder. There's a classic desktop, a modern phone, and then a shared folder. Those of you who've built universal applications in the past know that the shared capabilities were at the root under the app folder, and that seemed to be confusing for people. So we think this sort of a structure may make some sense and be easier to understand. So this is our starting point. And as you saw, the application itself runs and has one view that has a grid on it, and that grid produces data from a data store. So if we overview the way the structure of the application looks, in the modern desktop, we have a view folder. That view folder has one view called Home, and that Home folder has a view package in it. This is what we call a view package. It has the view itself, the SAS, the view controller, and the view model. So that's MVC and NVVM in action within Ext JS. This particular view happens to be extending from the Ext JS grid, and so the grid in this case needs a store. It points to a store, and it has a set of columns. So name, email, and phone. Name, email, and phone. The store itself is the store with the type called personnel. And you may think I would go to the modern desktop store folder to look for that. But there is no store named personnel. That's because we want to share as much code as we can, and the store functionality could just as easily be used by the phone as it can by the desktop. So instead of defining the store in the modern desktop folder, we're going to define that in the shared folder. So the store that we're using here, and you can see here, that's the name of it, personnel. This happens to be using a memory proxy, is equally usable between the desktop and the phone application. So this page right here and this page right here use and share the same store logic. They have different views because one's a phone view and one is a desktop view, but reuse is crucial in a well-designed and architected universal application. So at a high level, that's the structure of the universal application that got generated. Let's go ahead and move on, and let's talk about adding some server-side functionality to this application, because you saw that the store that I'm using for the sample is just a memory store. It's getting data right from the code. We want to get data from a server. In particular, we want to get data from a server that services and sends RESTful endpoints with JSON. And it turns out that RAD server from Embarcadero does exactly that. So I'm going to turn to my server design mode, and I'm going to go over to my Windows environment, and I'm going to bring up RAD Studio. RAD Studio is the integrated development environment that allows me to build a RAD server application. And a RAD server application is an application written with Delphi. So that's the tooling that we're talking about here. So I'm in RAD Studio. I'm going to create a new EMS package. This stands for Embarcadero Mobility Services. So this is a server that I'm going to create. I'm going to create it with one resource. The name of the resource is going to be an employee resource. So I want to serve out employee data. I could build all of my RESTful endpoints, gets and puts and deletes, but for the sake of this discussion, I'm just going to do get, and I'll go ahead and finish. Now, what I'm given here is an interface to the server that I could start writing code for. And this code, since I said I wanted an employee endpoint, is code that is all about employees. I'm going to save this project and change the name of this unit 1 to employee so it makes more sense. So I'm going to go ahead over here and I'm going to create a server. So I'll create a new folder here. And this new folder I'll call EMS server, EMS employee server. I'll go into that server. I will change my code here, which is the code to serve up employees, to employee. And I'll name the project employee project. So there's our project. If I were to simply run this right now, I have a full-fledged server as it sits. I can open the browser. You'll notice that the server is at port 8080. I can open the browser, and I have RESTful endpoints. I have one for version, and I also have one for employee, although I haven't written any code yet. But I do have a RESTful endpoint. Now I want to serve this RESTful endpoint to my client, so I need to know the IP address of this machine. So I'm going to IP config, and I'm going to see that it's 10.2.11.55.3. So I'm going to go back to my client environment, and I'm going to do the same query at 10.11.55.3 port 8080 employee. So you can see that on my client I am getting served that RESTful endpoint, but it doesn't have any code in it yet. So let's go back to our RAD server and fix that. You'll notice that the get function right here is just one simple line of code that's just writing out a string with the word employee. That's what we're going to change. We're going to change that so it writes out code that makes sense. So the first thing we're going to do, instead of writing all the connection logic, is we're going to go into design mode here and over to my data explorer, use the Embarcadero Interbase database for the employees database and bring the employee table over to my design palette with a drag and drop. You'll notice that gives me a connection and a table object that I can use in my code. This code is what I'm going to change. So this procedure to get, I'm going to change with code that I already have written that I will explain to you that will actually retrieve all the employees. So let's go ahead and paste that in. So essentially what this code is doing is it's grabbing the employee table that I designed onto my palette that I dragged and dropped, looping through that data and producing a JSON object, and then returning that JSON object. It's probably easier if I just show you. So I go ahead and run this, and I have to close off the previous one, so let me close that off. We close them both off. All right, let's run that again. Now I have port 8080. I open the browser. I go to employee. And I indeed have a set of data that was returned by the EMS server. I won't go into the details of that code until I show you how we work it into the client side. So let's go back to our client and refresh this page here, this RESTful call, to see that now we're retrieving data into our application or onto the client side. What I want to do now is make views in EXTJS that will consume this data. So let's go back to our application that we have written and go to my Visual Studio Code Editor, and we'll focus on the modern desktop. So the modern desktop is what is running right now in is what we want to have running. So what I'm going to do is, instead of just running Sencha App Watch and letting the default classic desktop profile run, I'm going to say I want it to run the modern desktop. So Sencha App Watch can only deal with watching one profile at a time. But since I'm working with the modern desktop at the moment, I'm going to have Sencha App Watch watch that profile. It's again at port 1841. And if I go back over here to my modern desktop, it is serving out this code here. So I need to write a view, and I need to write some data store logic. Let's start off with the view. As we saw, the way our application is structured, all views go under the view folder. And at the moment, we only have a home view, a login view, and a main view. I'm going to right-click on this view to open up a terminal window. So I'm in a terminal window at the view folder, and if I bring up my Sencha node command, you'll notice I have this Sencha node generate view package. So if I type Sencha node generate view package, and I'll name this view package employee, it generated the folder and the 4 items that comprise a view package inside of this view. So if I refresh this item, I have my 4 items for employee. I currently have no way to access them because I don't have a menu item to get me to employee. But one of the things that this particular template is doing, because I wrote it and we want to give you the ability to write them, is it tells me what to do in relevance to the template that I used to generate. So it says go to this menu.json file, add another entry to it. So resources, shared, data, menu.json. Add another entry, because the menu in this particular case is controlled by this JSON structure. And now if I refresh this page, I now have an employee menu item with a template employee view, which gets me part of the way to actually getting everything written. The other thing I need to do in here is populate this view, which currently is just a panel that just has some HTML in it, as a grid. So one of the ways we can do that is find an example or utilize our documentation. So you'll notice here I'm at the grid documentation, and it says if I want to use a grid, it is an extjs.grid.grid. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And I'll change this panel to be a grid. And then the grid needs 2 properties for it to function. We'll use 3. It needs a title, a store, and columns. So I'm going to get rid of this HTML and say make this grid have a certain title, and we'll give the title of employees. Make it use a store, and we'll make this type an employee store. An employee store, which I have not created yet, but I will in a moment. And then the columns that we need are the columns that we're seeing here: empno, first name, last name, and we'll just use those 3 columns just for our demonstration purposes. So empno, first name, and last name. And we'll just give them some nice titles: last, first, and ID. So that is our definition for our view. We now need a definition for the data store. And in like fashion, the data store that I'm going to be creating for this particular view can be shared between my mobile device and my desktop device. So I'm going to generate that data store in the shared environment. So I'm going to come down here to the shared environment and come down to the app folder level. Let me close off things to make it a little bit easier to see here. At the app folder level, I'm going to open up a terminal window because I want to take advantage again of Sencha Node, because Sencha Node lets me generate what we call a store package. And in this case, I want to create one called employee. So I'm just going to grab this example here and run it. And it generates two things for me. It generates a store and the model. So if I come over here to shared and refresh, I now have an employee store. And this employee store even has some examples of inline or RESTful interfaces. Well, I want a RESTful interface, so I'm just going to uncomment this. I want it to be auto-loaded. And this URL needs to be the URL that I retrieve this data from, which I know is this right here, because I've already tested it. So I'm going to bring in this URL. As far as reading the data, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but it's actually not just an array of data. It's an object with a key name employee, and then the value is the array. So I have to tell the RESTful interface that there's a key value employee it wants to read from. That's this root property. One other thing to notice is that this template is trying to enforce a standard naming convention so that every store is going to be the name, employee, in this case, and the word store. So this right here, that alias, is the name for the modern desktop employee views store type, which I'd already typed, but I just wanted to show you that. So we're getting some assistance from our tooling to make it easy to create the view and to create the store and optionally the model that goes along with this. So with all of this in place, if I did this right, we have the page, but we have no data coming through. Let's see if we can quickly figure out why that is the case. And I'm not sure what in particular the case is here. Let's take a quick look here. We have the employee store. It is a grid, and it has a model. But I'm not going to waste time looking for what the particular error is. I will tell you that I did this before to the modern phone as well, which is this particular item here. And because I have the template already generating the Cordova environment, if I show you the version of the application that is now pushed to my Android emulator, you'll see that I get this user interface that we saw before with an extra menu. And in this particular case, the data is being displayed using the exact same store, but a different visual interpretation. In this case, a list that is more appropriate for a phone than a full-featured grid that typically is used on a desktop. So that's a really, really high-level view at how you build these, how you structure and build these universal applications, including building a back end with the Embarcadero RAD server. If you want a lot more details than I went through on the RAD server, and the reason I didn't go through the code in much detail, Embarcadero is doing an event in a couple of weeks that is going into massive details on REST APIs in the RAD server. So sign up for that. As I said, December 19th, couple weeks, you'll get all the details you'll need, but it's essentially the same premise from a starting point of what I showed you. There are a set of best practices that are implied in building universal applications, some of which I've already mentioned, some of which I'll just make sure you're aware of. As I said, the most important thing is to architect with universal in mind. Even if you're just building a desktop application, use a template that uses this structure. You can always just build a desktop and think about the mobile later. It's a lot harder to have to reconfigure and re-architect your application once you've started down a path. Even though we built in a classic toolkit for the desktop and a modern toolkit for the desktop, and you can have either one be your desktop platform, if you are able to and you just use the modern toolkit, you'll have more opportunity to share things. The modern toolkit and the classic toolkit all rely on a common core, so things like stores and models can all be shared. View-oriented things between the two toolkits cannot be shared. If your desktop is modern and your phone is modern, you can also share views. So that makes the amount of sharing just that much better. So use the modern toolkit if you can. The places where you can't is where you still have to support legacy browsers, where you might need ARIA, screen reader support. If you're supporting right to left, those are the kind of things that aren't supported in the modern toolkit as we talk. Avoid a device-specific theme. I think the best universal applications look the same on the phone as they do on the desktop. There was this trend a while ago of making iOS applications look like iOS and Android applications look like Android. I think making your application look the same is more important. And I've talked about some of these here, how you organize your views, how you share your logic and data. A lot of this can be enforced by having an enterprise template that does support universal. So I'll leave these just for some reading. I want to talk about one more thing, and then we will get to questions. I've done all this, and now I'm ready to go to production. How do I build my desktop and my phone application for production? Well, if you're using Sencha Command, it's one simple step: Sencha app build production. So going back to my application here, if I am ready and I'm ready to build for production, Sencha app build. I don't even have to use the word production, it's the default, but I will anyway. This will build the entirety of your application, the two desktop profiles and the mobile, the modern phone profile as production applications. When this finishes and we come back and we look at this, we will find that we will have a build folder for production, and everything for this application will be built in that folder. Then, depending on what your migration needs are to your production server, you can take your desktop application, it's all in this folder, and you just bring it to your production environment. So the tooling via Sencha Node for generation and Sencha Command really make this whole process, the life cycle to production, an easy process. All right, so I went through a lot of detailed things there. I know I went somewhat fast. I know there a good bit of you are already Sencha Ext JS developers, but I want to leave some time for questions here. So I will turn it back to see if we do have any specific questions, and we'll go ahead and answer.
Yeah, great presentation, Mark. We do have some questions that have come in. We're going to try and get through as many of them as we can. But if we don't get to your question today, Sencha should be following up via email most likely to try and help you out with that. So first question we have is asking about mobile devices. So Mark would like to know, what about mobile devices that use wireless screen desktop, etc., so the mobile becomes your desktop? I think that's more company related, while mobile is more end consumer.
You know, I may want to defer that. I probably need more details as exactly what the question is asking.
Okay.
So
no problem.
Let's defer that question. so that I understand it better. And whoever asked that question, if you feel like emailing me directly, I can answer that for you.
Next question is from Michael. He'd like to know, is this the same as a microservices approach? If not, what is the difference?
No, you could term this a microservices approach. I think microservices is just stateless web services that are served via a JSON structure. So absolutely this fits into a microservices approach. I think just the size of your web service is what determines whether it's microservices or not. But bottom line answer, absolutely yes.
All right. Next question is from Vadim. Sorry if I mispronounced that. They would like to know, how do you build a store for big data sets? How do you send filter parameters from front to REST server? And how do you split data on pages? Great
question. As we were building this template, we said, well, what if we have questions like that? What if we have, big examples we want to show, but we don't want to clutter up the template? We decided to put an examples folder in here. And this examples folder can be used to put in questions like that, and it just so happens that in the modern desktop people folder, this is using a controller and a view that does big data. And the answer to your question is that it's done via, let me go to shared here, well, let me go to modern phone and store. It's done with a virtual store and setting your page sizes and leading and trailing buffer zones. This defines the parameters that are sent to the server, and they're sent as query string attributes. One is called page size and one is called limit, I believe, or I have to look specifically. But that's all defined with the virtual store. This is the modern toolkit way to do it. In the classic toolkit, it's called buffered store. It's coded the exact same way. There are just some technological reasons we had to create two different classes. So this example would show you exactly what to do. And as a matter of fact, when I was building this, I built a server that services this data in exactly the way it needs to be. It happens to be a node server. So if you're interested in all of that, I could show you both client and server.
All right. Next question is from James. He says, you mentioned creating 3 builds or profiles in the generated app. Can we create more than 3, and can we rename them?
Yes, good question. We created 3 builds just because we thought those were the 3 most likely builds you would need. There is no reason that you couldn't. Each of these builds is just a JSON object underneath this builds in app.json. There's no reason you couldn't have as many as you want. And there's no reason that this word, Classic Desktop, could be named whatever you want. We're pretty early in the process of creating this generator tool, and so it would need parameters to know how many builds you would want and what you want the names to be and whether they're classic and modern. Basically, enough information to build all of this. So absolutely, that can be done. There's nothing that says after the fact. I couldn't just sit here and say, you know what, Classic Desktop is just too long. I'm going to be doing this in Classic. I'm just going to call this one Desktop. I'm going to remove Modern Desktop, and I'm going to call this one Phone. Absolutely can do that, and your builds would work exactly the way you expect them to.
Great. Next question. I know I'm going to butcher this name, so I'm going to call you Andre, because that's kind of what it looks like, so I apologize. But Andre would like to know how to get partial data from the database.
Partial data as in not a select all is what I'm going to interpret your question to be. And just like when we need to do paging on the server, we get partial data, we get a page of data at a time. You could use the exact same technique to send a parameter in to say, I want all the employees that live in Florida. You'd send a parameter that would be either a query string for parameter or a form parameter, and the server or SQL would respond accordingly. So there are examples of that in our documentation, but that again could be another good example that we created specifically to allow you to maybe just copy and paste it. But it's pretty simple with a parameter.
Great. Next question is from Ernie. He'd like to know, will we be able to create our own project-specific templates in the future?
Yeah, that's one of the things we think would be valuable to all of you. As I said, this particular template, we're working on to try to bring in best practices and as many profiles as possible, but we think, and we would love to hear all your feedback, we think giving you guys the ability and opening up the concept and having documentation readily available that shows you how to build your own would allow your initial architect to build the structure that you need for your application, and then instead of generating something that you're just basically going to rip out, you could have a pretty well started application, and you could control or standardize the structure of the application. So yes, we would like to be able to do that. Give us some input, feedback, how important that is, and any commentary.
Great. Let's see, I've got another question from Mark, since we weren't able to answer his first one without a little bit more detail. So he was asking, can I assume the store is same as data source in a JSON define where the schema defines the fields as the model is client-side?
Yes. This whole concept of stores and models within Ext JS is what we call our data package, and it is all client-side. So you saw me create a store. I created that store in the shared space right here. And it actually refers to a model. That model here doesn't have anything in it currently. We used to have a situation where unless you defined all the fields in the model, the store would not return that data. And that meant you had to define everything in the model. We've since changed that to say if all you need is the data and there's no conversion involved, there's no model needed. So the only reason I would need a model for this data store would be if I wanted to, let's say, if I have a first name and a last name and I want to create a whole name and I want to do that client side, I would need to create a model for that field only and do that function on the client. So hopefully in all that I answered your question. Store and model are two client side concepts in Ext JS.
Okay. I think we've got probably just enough time for a couple more questions, so we'll try and squeeze these in here. We have another one from Vadim. Would like to know how do you send authorization token from the front to REST service for any request?
Yeah, of course, in this example, I didn't put any complexities because I almost ran out of time just showing you what I showed you. But where you would do those sorts of things would be in the proxy. There's all sorts of parameters to send headers and any sort of authentication things you need. I either will refer you to the documentation, or if you'd like my help in finding some of that, I'd be more than happy to help. And maybe as we're talking, I will bring back this first slide for you to jot down my email address. So the answer is within the store and the proxy. And there's some specific ways to set headers in those things.
Great. Well, that looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. Mark, is there anything else you'd like to say to the audience before we wrap things up?
No, as I said, we're looking to see if this approach where we open up the concept of creating starter templates and generation facilities makes sense and how you would use it. And I'd love to hear your feedback, on that. And the best way is to send me an email. So. Should you have some, I'd appreciate hearing from you.
Great. Well, I'd just like to thank Mark for a great presentation today. Also want to make sure that we thank our sponsor, Sencha, for providing the DZone audience with another great webinar presentation. Lastly, thank you to everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate it and hope that you learned something new that will help you in your developer career. Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.